Hey everyone, Bloodsplat here, and today I'm going to give you guys an in-depth discussion on the state of mages for Warlords of Draenor in PvP. Now this might get into some serious discussion, as you guys might have been able to tell, but I did a lot of research myself. I looked all over the place, and the only type of discussion that I saw kind of related to what I'm going to talk about has been on WoW PvP forums. And who reads those WoW PvP forums anymore? I'm sure there's a lot of people that still scroll through them, but they're not enjoyable to watch through. You can't get the full gist. There's no way you can read that all that bullcrap that goes on in there sometimes. So that's why I'm putting it into a kind of a summarized video format. So these are mainly going to be my opinions, though I think a lot of mages that have played mages in PvP at the moment can agree with me on what the points I'm going to talk to you guys about. But anyways, let's get right into it. Okay, so first of all, let's just go over a few things that Warlords of Draenor brought to PvP in general, and I'm sure most of you guys know about most of this stuff already, but let's just go over it for the sake of making this video make sense. So first of all, I'm sure everyone can agree that overall, Warlords of Draenor simplified things. And the first time in 10 years in any expansion, Warlords of Draenor actually was all about removal and making things more simple, since I'm sure most people can agree this sounded really good on paper. By the end of Mists of Pandaria, it had almost been impossible for any new player to introduce themselves into competitive PvP and succeed. The only type of players that were succeeding were players that had been playing for years and had to slowly introduce themselves into all the new abilities, the things that World of Warcraft was introducing throughout their expansions, so they didn't have to learn everything at once. Considering everyone's action bars were clustered as hell, your macros list was out of this world, there was just so much things going on, you had so many abilities to learn, and it was just overall a good idea to simplify things in Warlords of Draenor. As I said before, this sounded really good on paper, but once we actually got into Warlords of Draenor, in some certain cases, and especially in the case of mages, it really mattered, and it was a huge thing to pay attention on what areas Warlords of Draenor would affect mages and what actually they would be removing and overall simplifying. Another thing worth mentioning was reduction of health pools in Warlords of Draenor, and this kind of ties into the simplifying of the game, as it was getting crazy, because every single time we got a new expansion, every single time we got a new gear set before Warlords of Draenor, we always had an increase in health pools, and we got up to like 1 million health or something with all our buffs and stuff up towards the end of Mists of Pandaria, which was just crazy, out of this world, really inflated, so it was definitely needed. But this also kind of ties in to how the balancing of PvP works and how burst works in Warlords of Draenor, which is something I really want to touch on. First of all, let's talk about the other two specs available for mages that aren't as popular as Frost and aren't as viable, but definitely worth mentioning, and those two specs are Fire and Arcane. In my understanding of Fire, since Cataclysm, Fire has always been a close underdog to Frost in terms of viability, and it's just not worth the current state of Warlords of Draenor. I've had many of my friends, and I've seen many people in general just switching to Fire, trying it out, and a lot of them have had a lot of fun. And remember, fun is a factor. You all started playing World of Warcraft because it was a fun game and you had a ton of fun. So fun is a factor here, guys. And in terms of fun, when you actually start to learn how to play Fire well, and I would even say this kind of the same for Arcane, it's actually a very fun class to play, but it's only in those perfect situations that make the class viable, and that's why I highlight perfect. Even some players like Hansel has a tough time right now, and he even admits that the class or the spec is just not viable at the moment, and it's just too hard or too difficult to be able to tell exactly when you're going to be able to line up your pyro procs correctly and set up a good burst with your partner in arena or whatever it is. It's just unreliable in comparison to Frost, where you can kind of just press a series of buttons and get the same amount of burst, as much burst as you want every single time. Especially with the reduction in damage overall in Warlords of Draenor, it's just not worth for all that effort into getting the perfect burst off as Fire, which is why we're going to move on and go into the Arcane spec. When the Warlords of Draenor pre-patch came out, Arcane was welcomed with open arms. The amount of damage that Supernova, the new talent, was doing was absolutely crazy, in consideration that Warlords of Draenor was all about balance and not so much about classes and specs having crazy burst. But Arcane mages were absolutely one-shotting players with Supernova, and it was crazy, and people even thought that Arcane mages would be the new meta, but that didn't turn out to be the truth, as Supernova was quick to be nerfed by Blizzard, as they noticed it was quite crazy, and the amount of reliable, consistent damage Arcane has is quite poor, so it's just not a viable class. at the moment at all, I would say, and I think most mages would say it's probably the least viable spec for mages in consideration that you have to constantly spam Arcane Blast, and with the amount of interrupts that people have nowadays, it's almost impossible to get any type of consistent damage out, as it's impossible to work up your Arcane charges if you can't cast, and even when you get your Arcane charges up and use Supernova, it's not doing as much damage as it used to do in the early days of WoD. So that brings us to Frost next, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. Alright, so now we're talking about Frost, the spec that I would say I have most knowledge on, and most people would say is the most viable spec at the moment, and has been for quite some time in PvP. So this is where I really want to highlight simplicity and what that meant for Frost mages, in terms of how Frost mages were reworked in Warlords of Draenor. When you think back to Mists of Pandaria, Frost mages were all about that crazy burst that you were getting off with Frozen Orb and the amount of Fingers of Frost procs and Brain Freeze procs. We were known for doing so much damage in a short period of time because of the amount of procs that we could get off into a target with a Deep Freeze or whatever it was. It was just reliable, consistent damage with crazy bursts. That has been completely reworked, and it's just kind of crazy to see how different mages are now, or Frost mages are now, to be specific, in Warlords of Draenor. Frost mages were to say goodbye to their good old friend Frost Nova if they were to select the talent choice Ice Nova, which seems to be the only viable option in this tier, and you're pretty much forced into it if you were to get any sort of damage or burst out as a Frost mage in Warlords of Draenor. This was huge for the Frost mage class, or the Frost mage spec, excuse me, as it totally reworked the way you pull off burst as a Frost mage, as all of your damage and burst revolved around Ice Nova. If you guys want to check out an up-to-date guide on how to burst as a Frost mage efficiently with using Ice Nova, definitely check out the annotation link on the screen. It will link you guys to my up-to-date burst guide that I made not too long ago at all on how to burst efficiently as a Frost mage using Ice Nova. Long gone are the days of consistent damage for Frost mages as Ice Nova gets introduced, as Ice Nova lasts a very short period of time, and we pretty much rely on Ice Nova being up and just, you know, lining up all of our cooldowns at one particular time to do any noticeable amount of damage on a target or to take down the target. We highly rely on our partners in order to line up, you know, a good amount of burst or a good amount of damage on a target. And this ties into the second change that I wanted to talk about, which was the removal of Living Bomb. The removal of Living Bomb served as a significant change for Frost mages, as if you haven't noticed by now, we don't have any consistent dot damage as a Frost mage, which is a huge problem, since many Frost mages are asking themselves, what should they do in order to pull off any consistent damage? Many are stuck with asking themselves, what do I do in order to pull off any kind of damage, any reliable damage without my burst or cooldowns? And is it worth to cast Frostbolt? That has become a huge question. The damage output of Frostbolt is poor to say the least, even on some frozen targets, but many mages have no choice but to cast Frostbolt in order to get some sort of consistent damage output there when they don't have any cooldowns up. So this is a huge problem for you guys, as many classes have, you know, interrupts nowadays, and it just leads to huge problems in getting locked out on a Frost and wasting a lot of time for you and your team. I also wanted to touch on the change of altar time and how it doesn't affect your procs anymore, just your health and location, and this just makes it not a viable choice anymore, considering many Frost mages back in the past used to use altar time in order to get just an additional amount of damage with your procs and just be able to reset your procs whenever bursting, and it's just not a viable choice anymore over the other options on the talent tree, which are Ice Barrier and Flame Glow. The last specific change I wanted to talk about was the Deep Freeze change, and making it so that you can't spam a bunch of Ice Lances into a Deep Freeze target and have them all affected by the Shatter effect. Only the first Ice Lance will be affected by Shatter, and the others will not get the increased damage effect. However, you still can cast a bunch of Frostbolts into a Deep Freeze target and have them all affected by Shatter and get that increased damage effect. This was a change recently implemented, as it was definitely needed, though the question arises of how many Frostbolts can you get into a Deep Freeze target? Is it worth casting Frostbolt into a Deep Freeze target, or should you just use Deep Freeze for CC and control rather than, you know, offensive damage and pressure? This is just, again, less consistent damage, less short cooldowns that we can use as a Frost mage to get more damage output. And yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about it, as I did make a whole entire video talking about it. So again, I'm going to leave an annotation link on the screen. Definitely go and check that video out, guys. I know a lot of people that watched it found it very helpful. I talked all about, you know, Deep Freeze and Frostbolt and when's the best time to use deep freeze. But other than that, let's get into the conclusion. To conclude this in-depth discussion on the state of mages of PvP, there are various amounts of factors you have to take into account in terms of viability. You have to remember that it's not all about doing an insane amount of damage, but remember that mages have always had an insane amount of control, CC, and support for their team. This explains why you've always seen mages up there in the 3v3 ladder boards, and even though this season the mage strong point isn't really about all damage and burst, the control and CC is just too much to pass off, and that's why you still see a bunch of mages achieving high ratings in 3v3 arena. However, you still have to take into account how fun the class is, and many people associate fun with being able to hit those high numbers and doing that insane burst that mages used to be able to do. So that's why you see a bunch of people complaining on the forums here and there, and the reason why I thought I should make this video. Regardless, that wraps up our discussion on the state of WoW PvP and mages. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave it a big like, a comment down below telling me guys what you think, and also make sure to subscribe. Thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you guys next time.